Right now, as you're sitting here watching this, the cost of putting a roof over your head in America is climbing. And I'm not talking about some slow, creeping increase you'll barely notice. I'm talking about thousands of dollars being added to the price of every new home, every renovation, every apartment being built in this country. And here's the thing that should genuinely concern you. It doesn't matter if you're not buying a house right now. If you rent, your landlord's costs just went up, which means your rent is about to go up. If you're a contractor, your margins just got squeezed. If you're a flipper, your numbers just stopped making sense. And if you're one of the millions of young Americans who've been saving up, grinding away, dreaming about that first home, what I'm about to walk you through is going to make your stomach drop. Because the American dream of homeownership didn't just get harder. It got deliberately, measurably, provably harder because of one policy decision that was supposed to protect American workers, but ended up punishing them instead. It all started with a bold claim and an even bolder decision. In March of 2025, President Trump directed the Commerce Department to launch what's called a Section 232 investigation into timber and lumber imports. Now, Section 232 is a specific legal tool. It allows the president to impose tariffs on imports that are deemed a threat to national security. Not economic competitiveness, not trade fairness, national security. That distinction matters enormously, and you'll see why in a moment. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick led the investigation, and the findings were used to justify something that caught the entire housing industry off guard. President Trump essentially told America that we don't need Canada's lumber. He pointed to the fact that the United States has roughly 300 billion trees. His executive order stated that America possesses, and this is the actual language, an abundance of timber resources that are more than adequate to meet our domestic timber production needs. Sounds reasonable on the surface, right? America has trees. America has land. Why would we need to buy wood from Canada? But here's what that claim left out, and it's the gap between the promise and reality that has turned into an economic wound for millions of American families. Having trees and having the industrial infrastructure to turn those trees into construction-grade lumber at the scale America needs are two completely different things. And that gap, that disconnect between the raw resource and the finished product, is where this whole thing falls apart. The national security justification itself raised eyebrows across the industry. The Commerce Department argued that wood products serve critical functions for the Department of Defense. They cited military infrastructure, housing for military personnel, transporting munitions, and even thermal protection components for nuclear reentry vehicles. Now, nobody's going to argue that the military doesn't use wood products. Of course it does. But the idea that kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities represent a national security concern had industry leaders shaking their heads. Because those products were lumped right into the same tariff package, and that's where the financial pain really starts to stack up. Here's the timeline, and pay close attention because the numbers escalate fast. On September 30th, 2025, President Trump signed a presidential proclamation imposing a brand new 10% tariff on all imported softwood timber and lumber. On top of that, a 25% tariff on kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and upholstered wooden furniture. These tariffs went into effect on October 14th, 2025, but that was just the opening act. On January 1st, 2026, those tariffs on kitchen cabinets and vanities jumped to 50%. The tariffs on upholstered wooden furniture climbed to 30%. And here's what makes this truly devastating. None of this happened in isolation. Canadian softwood lumber was already getting hammered with anti-dumping and countervailing duties totaling about 35%. These were existing tariffs that had been in place for years as part of the long-running US-Canada lumber dispute. So when the new 10% Section 232 tariff got stacked on top of the existing 35%, Canadian lumber entering the United States started facing total duties exceeding 45%. 45%. Nearly half the value of the lumber is now just tariffs. And this matters more than you might think because Canada isn't some minor player in the American lumber supply chain. Canada accounts for approximately 85% of all US softwood lumber imports. That's not a rounding error. That's not a secondary supplier. That is the backbone of America's lumber supply, and it just got taxed at a rate that fundamentally changes the economics of building anything in this country, and it didn't stop there. The broader tariff structure included IEEPA tariffs on Canadian goods, Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum at 50%, copper tariffs at 50%. Layer after layer of additional costs on the materials that go into every single home, every apartment, every renovation. The construction industry wasn't just dealing with one tariff. It was dealing with a web of overlapping trade actions that collectively represent the most aggressive tariff regime America has seen in nearly a century. So let's talk about what President Trump's executive order actually claimed versus what the data shows. The order said America has more than enough timber resources to meet domestic production needs. 300 billion trees. Sounds like plenty. But here's the fundamental problem that the entire lumber industry, every economist, and anyone who understands manufacturing has been screaming about since day one. Trees are not lumber. A forest is not a supply chain. And the United States does not currently have the capacity to turn its raw timber into finished construction-grade lumber at the volume American builders need. That is not opinion. That is measurable, documented fact. As of the first quarter of 2025, U.S. sawmills were operating at just 64.4% of their potential capacity. And that number hasn't been going up. It's been on a steady downward trend since 2017. More capacity has been added on paper, but actual production has stayed flat. Sawmill employment has dropped to its lowest level since 2021. Mills have the theoretical ability to produce more, but they don't have the workers, they don't have the orders, and frankly, they don't have the economic incentive to do so. Think about what it actually takes to turn a standing tree into a 2x4 sitting on a shelf at a building supply store. You need logging operations. You need transportation from the forest to the mill. You need sawmills with modern equipment. You need trained workers to operate that equipment. You need drying and treatment facilities. You need grading and quality control systems. You need distribution networks to get the finished lumber to builders across the country. Each of those steps requires infrastructure, investment, and time. You cannot executive order your way into an overnight industrial transformation. The supply chain that moves Canadian lumber into American construction sites was built over decades. Replacing it would take years under the best of circumstances. And here's the cruel irony. Even during the pandemic lumber boom of 2021 and 2022, when lumber prices were at historic highs and every mill in the country had every financial incentive to produce as much as humanly possible, U.S. production barely budged. If record high prices couldn't meaningfully increase domestic output, how exactly are tariffs supposed to accomplish what the free market couldn't? The National Association of Home Builders, which represents the people who physically construct houses in this country, conducted surveys showing that tariffs have already added approximately $9,200 to the average cost of a new single-family home. That was their estimate based on builder feedback from early 2025. But as the tariffs kept stacking up, the numbers got worse. The Center for American Progress, a policy research organization, published an analysis in December 2025 that put the figure significantly higher. They estimated that tariff-related costs are adding about $17,500 to the cost of every new home being built in America. Their methodology used Brookings Tax Policy Center data showing that current tariffs will add roughly $30 billion to the costs of investment in residential structures, with about 90% of that falling on the construction of new homes and apartments. And here's the number that should keep every policymaker up at night. The Center for American Progress projected that these tariff-induced higher building costs will result in approximately 450,000 fewer homes being built over the next 5 years through 2030. 450,000 homes that will simply not exist in a country that is already facing a housing shortage measured in the millions. Depending on which estimate you use, whether it's Freddie Mac's figure of 3.7 million units, Brookings' estimate of 4.9 million, or the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's assessment of more than 7 million affordable units short, the gap is enormous. And we are actively, deliberately making it worse. The construction slowdown is already visible in the data. Single-family home construction starts in April 2025 were down 12% compared to April 2024. Builders are pulling back because the math simply doesn't work anymore. When material costs spike unpredictably, when you can't quote a customer a reliable price because tariff rates might change next month, when lenders start getting nervous about underwriting projects where costs could blow up mid-construction, the rational response is to build less. And that is exactly what's happening. There was a building material supplier in Farmingdale, New York, a company called J.C. Ryan. They had a contract to supply wooden doors and frames for an apartment complex in Nassau County. They were sourcing from a Canadian company because it was more cost-effective than the American equivalent. Half the job was already delivered before the tariffs kicked in. On the remaining $75,000 worth of materials, the tariff added $19,000 to the cost. After the supplier applied their standard markup, the customer ended up owing $30,000 more than originally planned. $30,000 on one contract for wooden doors. Or take the contractor in San Diego named Bar Zakim, who runs a company called Better Place Design and Build, specializing in accessible dwelling units. He said Canada remains the best source for the lumber his business needs, but sticking with imported lumber forced him to raise his prices about 15% compared to a year ago. His words were telling. He said he's not about to go out of business, but it's looking to be a slow, expensive year. And these stories are playing out across every state in the country. The Federal Reserve's Beige Book, which examines economic conditions through all 12 regional Fed districts, specifically highlighted concerns from construction contacts about rising lumber prices. 4 of the 12 regional banks, including Richmond, St. Louis, Kansas City, and San Francisco, all referenced worries about higher building material costs. Construction activity has declined. Builders are now inserting escalation clauses into their contracts because they literally cannot predict what materials will cost from one week to the next. Lenders are becoming more cautious in their underwriting because of the risk that material costs could blow up during a project. And here's the part that makes this particularly painful. The people getting hurt the worst are not the big national home builders. Companies like Toll Brothers and D.R. Horton and Lenner, they have long-term supply contracts that insulate them from short-term price shocks. They negotiated those deals months or years in advance. They have the buying power and the financial cushion to absorb volatility. But the small builder, the local contractor, the family-owned construction company building 10 or 15 homes a year in your community, they have none of those protections. They're buying materials at current market prices, and when those prices jump because of tariffs, they face an impossible choice. Eat the cost, which they can't afford, pass it to the buyer, which prices more Americans out of the market, or just stop building altogether, and increasingly they're choosing option 3. The National Association of Home Builders estimates that for every $1,000 increase in the cost of a home, more than 100,000 potential buyers get priced out of the market. When you're adding $9,000 to $17,000 per home, you're talking about millions of Americans who can no longer afford to buy. That's not theoretical. That's happening right now. On January 20th, 2025, his very first day in office, President Trump signed an executive order directing departments and agencies to deliver emergency price relief by pursuing actions to lower the cost of housing and increase housing supply. Day 1. Lower housing costs. Increase supply. That was the explicit stated goal of the administration, and then the tariff policy did the precise opposite. NAHB Chairman Carl Harris didn't mince words. He said this move to raise tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods will have the opposite effect of the president's own housing goals. He pointed out that more than 70% of the imports of 2 essential materials that home builders rely on, softwood lumber and gypsum, which is used for drywall, come from Canada and Mexico, respectively. Tariffs on these materials increase construction costs, discourage new development, and consumers end up paying for the tariffs in the form of higher home prices. The contradiction is staring everyone in the face. You can't promise affordable housing with one hand while taxing the materials needed to build that housing with the other. It doesn't work. And every credible analysis of this situation arrives at the same conclusion. The Brookings Institution spelled it out clearly. They wrote that the administration's recent tariff actions expose a growing contradiction. At every level of government, there are efforts underway to lower the cost of housing and expand supply, from the expansion of the low-income housing tax credit to block grants supporting housing and zoning reforms, to infrastructure investments designed to encourage new construction. And then tariffs on the very materials required to build new homes cut against all of those efforts, adding cost and slowing production. The Tax Foundation, which has tracked every tariff action meticulously, now estimates that the Trump tariffs collectively represent an average tax increase of somewhere between $1,300 and $2,100 per U.S. household in 2026, depending on which model you use. That's on top of already record-high home prices, on top of mortgage rates hovering above 6%, on top of the fact that home ownership affordability has reached generational lows, with the Atlanta Fed's data showing that owning a median-priced home now consumes nearly 48% of the median household's income. The traditional threshold for affordability is 30%. We're not just above it. We're in a completely different stratosphere, and the age of the typical first-time home buyer has surged to 40 years old. That used to be 33 just 5 years ago. An entire generation is being locked out of the housing market, and the tariff policy is making the lock even harder to pick. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court issued its landmark ruling in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump. By a vote of 6-3, the justices held that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEEPA, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, joined by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Jackson. Roberts wrote that based on 2 words separated by 16 others in IEEPA, the president asserts the independent power to impose tariffs on imports from any country, of any product, at any rate, for any amount of time. And those words, Roberts said, cannot bear such weight. It was a significant check on executive power. The IEEPA tariffs had been the backbone of the administration's trade war, generating an estimated $175 billion to $200 billion in customs revenue in 2025 alone. The ruling invalidated the reciprocal tariffs, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, and the immigration and fentanyl-related tariffs that had been imposed under IEEPA authority. But here's the critical part for anyone who cares about housing costs. The Section 232 tariffs on lumber survived. They were imposed under a completely different legal authority, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, and the Supreme Court's decision did not touch them. The 10% tariff on softwood lumber? Still standing. The 50% tariff on kitchen cabinets? Still standing. The 30% tariff on furniture? Still standing. The existing anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Canadian lumber that push the total rate above 45%? All still in effect. Within hours of the ruling, President Trump signed a proclamation imposing new tariffs under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, initially at 10% on all imports globally, which he quickly raised to the maximum allowed rate of 15%. These Section 122 tariffs went into effect on February 24, 2026, and they're limited to 150 days unless Congress votes to extend them. The administration simultaneously launched multiple Section 301 investigations that could be used to reimpose even higher tariffs under different legal authority once the 150-day window closes. Treasury Secretary Bessent stated publicly that combining Section 122, Section 232, and Section 301 tariffs would result in virtually unchanged tariff revenue in 2026. Read between those lines. The administration isn't backing down. They're just using different legal tools to achieve the same tariff levels. And legal challenges to the Section 122 tariffs have already been filed, with 24 states arguing that the conditions required by Section 122 don't actually exist. So the legal landscape is shifting, but the lumber tariffs, the ones that matter most for housing, haven't budged. And while the courts sort out the rest, American families keep paying the price every single day. Prime Minister Mark Carney was blunt about the situation. He said the decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States is now over. Think about that statement for a moment. This isn't diplomatic hedging. This is the Prime Minister of America's largest trading partner declaring that the old relationship is finished. And Carney backed it up with specifics. He pointed out that 90% of Canada's lumber exports, 90% of their aluminum exports, and 90% of their steel exports were all going to a single market, the United States. He called those concentrations vulnerabilities rather than strengths. And his government announced a massive support package for the Canadian lumber and steel industries, $700 million in loan guarantees, $500 million for long-term industry support, and a commitment to cut freight rates for moving lumber across Canada by 50% to make interprovincial trade more affordable. The entire strategy is about diversification. Canada is actively building new trade relationships in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East. They're looking for buyers who will pay fair prices without the drama of constantly shifting tariff regimes. And from Canada's perspective, this makes perfect sense. Why would you continue to send 90% of your exports to a market that keeps punishing you with duties when there are billions of people in other parts of the world who need construction materials? But here's what that means for America in the long run, and this is the part that keeps trade analysts up at night. If Canada successfully diversifies its lumber exports, if they build durable relationships with buyers in Asia and Europe, if they invest in the port infrastructure and shipping capacity to serve those markets efficiently, then when America eventually needs that Canadian lumber again, and we will need it, the supply might not be available. The relationships might not be there, the pricing might not be favorable, the logistics chains might have been rebuilt to serve other markets. We could be looking at a permanent structural shift in the North American lumber market that leaves America in a worse position than when this all started. Not just temporarily more expensive lumber, but a fundamental realignment of global lumber trade that reduces American leverage and access for decades to come. And all because of a tariff policy that was supposed to protect American industry, but instead is driving our most important lumber supplier into the arms of our competitors. The Tax Foundation calls the Trump tariffs the largest U.S. tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. The Budget Lab at Yale University estimates that overall construction sector output could fall by 4.1% over the next 3 years due to tariffs. The housing shortage in America, which was already severe before any of this started, is getting worse, not better. Multiple estimates put the gap anywhere from 3.7 million to 7 million units depending on the methodology, and we are now actively widening that gap by making it more expensive to build. Canadian softwood lumber faces total duties exceeding 45%. Kitchen cabinet tariffs have jumped to 50%. Furniture tariffs sit at 30%. Steel and aluminum tariffs are at 50%. Copper tariffs are at 50%. The Section 232 lumber tariffs survived the Supreme Court ruling. The administration has replaced IEEPA tariffs with Section 122 tariffs, while pursuing Section 301 investigations that could result in permanent replacements at similar or higher rates. An estimated 450,000 fewer homes will be built over the next 5 years because of these costs. The average new home costs anywhere from $9,200 to $1,750 more because of tariffs. Small builders and local contractors are bearing the brunt of the impact because they lack the long-term supply contracts that insulate national builders. Construction starts are declining, lenders are pulling back, and the promised ramp-up of domestic lumber production has not materialized in any meaningful way because expanding an entire industry doesn't happen overnight, no matter how many executive orders you sign. Meanwhile, Canada is actively diversifying away from the American market, potentially creating a permanent structural shift that will make North American lumber more expensive for generations. The Federal Reserve's data shows construction contacts across the country expressing deep concern about rising costs and declining activity. And the fundamental contradiction at the heart of this policy, promising affordable housing while taxing building materials, remains unresolved. Now, I want to step back from the numbers for a moment and talk about what this means in human terms. Because behind every statistic is a family that can't afford their first home. Behind every canceled construction project is a small business owner who had to lay off workers. Behind every rent increase is a single parent trying to figure out how to make the budget work. Housing is not an abstract economic concept. It is the most fundamental need after food and safety. And when housing becomes unaffordable, everything else starts to crumble. People commute longer, spending more on gas and less time with their families. People delay starting families because they can't afford a place to raise children. People stay in relationships they should leave because they can't afford to live on their own. Communities stagnate because young people can't afford to live where they grew up. This isn't a red issue or a blue issue. This is an American issue. When your rent goes up by $200 a month because there aren't enough homes being built, that money comes out of your pocket regardless of who you voted for. When the dream of owning a home keeps getting pushed further out of reach, that's a failure that crosses every political line. The Brookings Institution put it perfectly. If the administration truly aims to make housing more affordable, then trade policy needs to support housing policy, not work against it. And right now, those two things are on a direct collision course, and regular American families are standing at the point of impact. The claim that America doesn't need Canada's lumber has been tested by the cold, hard reality of supply chains, industrial capacity, and market economics. And reality has delivered its verdict. We do need that lumber. We need it right now. And until there's a real, workable plan to replace it, not a wish, not a promise, not an executive order, but an actual plan backed by investment and infrastructure, these tariffs are not protecting American workers. They're not strengthening national security. They're not growing the economy. That's the truth. That's the real story. And it's a story that's far from over, because the ripple effects of this policy are going to be felt for years, possibly decades, regardless of what happens next in the courts or in Congress. The damage to trade relationships, to builder confidence, to housing supply, and to the wallets of everyday Americans, that damage is already done, and it's compounding every single day. So if this video helped you understand what's really going on, share it with someone who needs to see it. Share it with that friend who's been trying to buy a house and can't figure out why everything is so expensive. Share it with that family member who works in construction and is watching their business get squeezed. Share it with anyone who cares about the future of housing in this country, because the more people understand the real forces driving up costs, the better equipped we all are to demand better from the people making these decisions.